Now, before I can actually make any kind of podcast episode for you guys, I want to explain one thing. Have you guys heard about Anchor? It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain how. One, it's free. Two, there's just many tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. And it'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other things like iTunes and such. You can make more money from your podcast regardless on how much you have already. So it's like extra money. Hello, who doesn't like free money? And then, it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one spot. So whenever you can, just download the free Anchor app at, your iTunes store, your Apple store, or your Google Play store, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thanks, y'all.
Now we are all on chapter 6. Marilla makes up her mind, which I'm very excited. I don't know, I've been thinking the way I explained it earlier to Hakeem. I'm not sure fully if I explained it correctly, but I think I explained it the best way I thought. And so hopefully it was understood. But and so far from the last chapter, we found out Marilla is taking Anne to Mrs. Shepherd, and she asked Anne what her life history basically was. And it was pretty deep, it was pretty intense, and it was a little it was pretty how do you call it? I guess just like wow, Hopefully from what she has learned about Anne, she makes up her mind in the best way possible and decides to actually keep her. Which I think she does because, like Matthew Cuthbert said, she's an interesting girl. Talks about is very imaginative and it's very interesting, and it's different. It's something. It's things that you don't really hear from a girl, I guess, in that moment or in that time, in that town or anything like that. So I'm very excited to see what goes on. Yeah, so far it's she was okay. So to recap her life, her history, she was born in what is it, Bowling or blah blah blah. Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia, and her father was Walter Shirley. Her mother was Bertha Shirley, and both her parents were friggin' teachers at a high school. And she was talking about what she liked from the smells of the roses and the sight of the roses, the names that she didn't like for people like men like Jedediah. She doesn't like Jedediah, but it's an okay name because Marilla said it was okay. Like she made her think differently a little bit. She had after with her parents, after having to leave them, she went to a home with a Mrs. Thomas, and she said that Anne was the homeliest baby she's ever seen, scrawny, tiny, and all that stuff. But she, of course, thought she was a disappointment to her, and Anne thought she was a disappointment to Mrs. Thomas. She died of fever and then left her an orphan, got her to, excuse me, got her to someone else, and the Mrs. Well, yeah, hold up. I'm trying to make sure that I'm saying it correctly, that I'm recapping it correctly. Okay, after Mr. and Mrs. Shirley, they both died of fever. She went to Mrs. Thomas. Mrs. Thomas had a drunken husband. Then from there, after she left them, she went from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and she stayed with the Thomas children, which were 4 children younger than her, right? And then she was at her wit's end with her, and then took her to Mrs. Hammond. Mrs. Hammond was up, was up the street with, um, what is it, just up, I guess up the street from past the river or something like that. And then Mrs. Hammond is the one who had the 8 children. The 8 children, she was the one taking care of the 8 children, which is the twins by succession. And then, or in succession, I'm sorry. And then after Mrs. Hammond, that's when she went over to Hopetown to Mrs. Spencer. And Mrs. Spencer took her and did all that, right? Now, we are on, that's the wrong spot. We are on to where chapter 6, it says Marilla makes up her mind. Now, from what it seems like, though, in the history that Anne gave Marilla, it does seem like, it's kind of changing Marilla's mind to keep her. And I apologize. So sorry. Hey to you guys, Doobie, Danielle Grant, and M. Cope. Sorry about that. I'm not sure exactly what was last heard, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get into the chapter 6 where Marilla makes up her mind. So you are in with me, which is for Storytime with Izzii. We are reading Anne of Green Gables, which is a nostalgic book from the school days. We are going towards chapter 6 where Marilla makes up her mind, and I thank you guys for coming in and listening. I'm excited for you guys. Chapter 6. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. "Dear, dear," she exclaimed, "you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in, and how are you, Anne?" "I'm as well as can be expected, thank you," said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. "I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare," said Marilla, "but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy, 10 or 11 years old." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so," said Mrs. Spencer in distress. "Why, Robert sent word down by his daughter Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl. Didn't she, Flora Jane?" Appealing to her daughter, she had come out to the steps. "She certainly did, Mrs. Cuthbert," corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. "I'm dreadful sorry," said Mrs. Spencer. "It's too bad. But it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Mrs. Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for her heedlessness. It was your own fault, said Marilla resignedly. We should have come to you ourselves and not left an unimportant message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do is to set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they? I suppose so, said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she sent by me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she said she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential. Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett, his house Blewett, only by sight as a small, shrewish-faced woman without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones. But she had heard of her. A terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Over to her tender mercies. Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over, she said. And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute, exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall into the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained to long enough dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. That is real lucky for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Mrs. Cuthbert, and you sit here on the ottoman and don't wriggle. Let me take your hats, Flora Jane. Go out and put Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. Or Mrs. B. I'm just going to call her Mrs. B. Because I feel like I blew it on the name. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you to ladies. Mrs. B, Mrs. Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven. Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. B as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration, or settling it out of hand. It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. B, she said. I was under the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so, but it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you. Mrs. B darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. How old are you, and what's your name? She demanded. Anne Shirley, faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof. And I'm 11 years old. Huh. You don't look as if there was much to you. But you're wiry. I don't know but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know. Good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Mrs. Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you'd like, I can take her right home now. Marilla looked at Anne and softened at sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, It would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. B to hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman. No, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. Well, I don't know, she said slowly. I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I aren't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. B? I suppose it'll have to do, said Mrs. B ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First the look of despair faded out, then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured. And a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. B went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Mrs. Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it, or did I only imagine you did?" "I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne. If you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet after all. She certainly needs you much more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go to live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try and do and be anything you want me if you only keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla, from afar, had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read on his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I want to give a dog I like to that bee woman," said Matthew with unusual vim. "I don't fancy her style myself," admitted Marilla, "but that's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems sort of a duty. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it. But I'll do my best. So far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. "Well now, I reckoned you come to see it in that light, Marilla," he said. "She's such an interesting little thing." It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla, "but I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. Enough to put your oar in." There, Marilla, you can have your own way," said Matthew reassuringly. "Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if you only get her to love you." Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. "I won't tell her tonight that she can stay," she reflected, as she strained the milk into the creamers. "She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it. Him, that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, We've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it. And that was chapter 6. Next time is going to be chapter 7, which is Anne Says Her Prayers. So this is getting exciting, y'all. She's keeping her. Mainly because she wants to see what it's going to be like, and because Matthew really wanted to keep her in the first place. So yeah, it's working. It's happening. It's fun. It's going to be a cute little family. So I'm excited. All right. So thank you to Dr. Rao, Wandering Fool, Poison Pin, Marianne Baker, Louis Vasquez, T Solo, Anthony Thomas, Wisdom's Auntie Lady Q, JF Bay 30 High Podcast, and Roy. I appreciate you guys coming in, listening in with me. And until next time, this was Storytime with Izzii, reading Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 6. Marilla made up her mind. And she made up her mind well. I'm very excited. I'm so happy. So now it's all up to them. How is it gonna be? How is she gonna be trained? That's my next question. We'll see how it goes. But much love, respect, blessings to all of you guys. Hugs and kisses from me to you. And I will talk to you soon. And I will be back for the next chapter, chapter 7. Woo-woo. All right. Peace, y'all.
Yay!